Well, hey there! In today's episode of B.Hooked, we'll have a look at how to knit a simple chevron stitch. This is a great stitch pattern for lots of different projects, and it's even easy enough for a beginner. We will incorporate a couple different decreases and one increase, but don't let that scare you away. It's really simple. Now you can find the written instructions as well as more information about the yarn I'll be using, Red Heart Colorscape, over on my website. You can access that at bhookedcrochet.com/knit chevron. All right, now let's get to it. We're going to start off with the Longtail Cast on, and for that you're going to need a long tail. So you can take the educated approach where you wrap around your needle, and ideally that is the amount of yarn that you'll need for the number of stitches that you have wrapped. Now for me, I'm just working a little test swatch here. I recommend that you do the same as well. We'll just be using 30 stitches here. So I'm just going to grab some slack and then I will flip it over. Grab your needles and just place that over top of your needle. Now you can create a slip knot here. Some people do that. I really prefer not to. So I'll leave that looped over. I'll hold on to that with my fingers, and with this two edge, I'm going to kind of stick my finger and my thumb in there, gather it up at the bottom to work my long tail cast on. Now I'll spread my finger and my thumb apart, and then I'm going to wrap it around, catch this front strand from my thumb, loop it around, catch that strand from my pointer finger, and then I'll take my thumb strand and I'll release it over the tip of the needle. And you can tighten things up. And we'll just repeat that. Now if you're brand new to the Longtail Cast on, I do also have a completely beginner-friendly video to just this technique. I'll have that linked here in the video and in the description as well, so you can check that out if you need a little more guidance. Now for this particular stitch pattern, we're working in a multiple of 14 plus 2. Now for my swatch, I will cast on 28 stitches. That is my multiple of 14, and then I'll add 2. So adding that all together, I'm going to cast on 30 stitches. Now when you're planning your projects, work in that multiple of 14. So 14 plus 14 plus 14, however long you want it, and then add the 2 at the end. Now once you have your 30 stitches, or however many stitches you're working for your project, cast on your needles, we're ready to start on row number 1. Now row number 1 is the wrong side of the work. This is not a reversible stitch pattern. It looks different on the front and on the back. So for row number 1, we want to purl all of our stitches. But I do need to have my working yarn in front. So I'll just slide my needle there behind it, and then I'll insert my needle purlwise, or from back to front, in that first stitch. And I can gather up my yarn, wrap it around, purl it off. Do that for all stitches in this row. So if you want to look at it from a point that's easy to memorize, all of our odd numbered rows are going to be purled. Every single stitch we're just going to purl. Now once you've finished purling your first row, we can go ahead and turn our work, and we'll start on row number 2. Now row number 2, an even number row, we have the same repeat for all even number rows. We're going to incorporate a lot of different stitches, but I promise this stitch pattern is memorizable. After you work it a few rows, you'll have the hang of it in no time. So for the first stitch, we want to knit. Then we need to knit front back. This is an increase here. So I'll insert my needle as if to knit. I'll knit it like normal, but instead of sliding it off the needle like I would normally slide it off here, I'm going to hold things there, swing the needle around, find the back part of the stitch, and stick my needle in there. So I've caught that through the back, then I'll knit that. Then we can slide it off. So that results in 2 stitches there. It's just a standard knitting increase. Next, we're going to knit 4. So before we move on to the next part of the repeat, I want to show you where we have worked so far. So this is what the stitch pattern looks like once it's finished. We start over here, we sort of work down to the valley, and then we have our point to attend to, and then we work up. We've got something else that we need to do here, and then the repeat starts over. We work down, we work up. So think of it at the points is where you need to pay most attention. Of course, we've got something to do at the very ends, but we have to work some special stitches here in the bottom points and the top points. Okay, so just keep that in your mind as we work the next couple of stitches. Now the next stitch we're going to work is a decrease. It's very simple, but it has a pretty complicated name. A slip knit PSSO. So all that is we're going to take this next stitch, I'll insert my needle knitwise, just as if I were going to knit it, and I'll just pass it over. Then I'll knit the next stitch, so that was our slip. We're doing the knit here. And then the PSSO part is pass slipped stitch over. So this is my slipped stitch. It's basically just the one that's right next to my knit. And then I'll just pass it over. This is very similar to the bind off motion. Now we need to mirror that with another decrease, this time the knit 2 together. So I'll isolate these next 2 stitches. I'll stick my needle in them both knitwise and knit it as if it were only one. So we've got that bottom point down. We're ready to start working up. And when we do that, we're going to knit 4. So now we're at that top point and we need to increase for the top point. We're going to do some more knit front backs. You've already seen this there at the beginning of the row here. We'll insert our needle knitwise, knit it, but don't pass it over. We'll swing it around, stick your needle in that back loop, and then knit. And these can get a little tight, to be honest with you. It's easy if we just try to be as relaxed as possible. We're going to knit front back on the next stitch as well. So this front one is always pretty loose. It's easy to work. As you're swinging it around, getting your needle into that back part, that's where it can be a little bit tight, and we have a tendency to muscle it, and that really works against us. So try to keep your yarn as relaxed as possible so you can get 2 stitches where the tension is pretty uniform. Now we've worked that point at the top. That's all we have to do. So we're working down now. We'll knit 4. That also starts the repeat. Now we're at the next bottom point. Remember, we have that big long name of a decrease. We're going to slip, knit, and then pass the slipped stitch over. The next decrease is knit 2 together. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get your needle in there too. Then we're going to knit 4. And if you're working this swatch with me, you should have only 2 stitches remaining. If you're working through a full project, that's totally fine. Just follow the repeat that we've covered here. When you get to 2 stitches, we're going to knit front back this second to last stitch. So that same increase. It's really the only increase that we use for this stitch pattern. Then we'll knit the last stitch. Now that finishes row number 2. We don't see much of our stitch pattern here. We're ready to go ahead and flip our work. Now we're looking here on the wrong side of the work. We're also starting on row number 3, which is an odd number, right? So every time we're looking at the wrong side or we're working on an odd numbered row, we're just going to purl every single stitch. The thing I really like about this stitch pattern is that although it looks very complicated, and yes, we are incorporating 2 different decreases and an increase, the row repeat is really simple. We're just alternating 2 rows over and over, and all you have to do is just memorize that second row repeat. For me, it took me about 5 or 6 rows before I didn't have to look at the written instructions anymore. And those instructions, once again, can be found over on my website, bhookedcrochet.com/knit chevron. I'll have it linked in the video description, just in case. Now, once you've finished up row number 3 and you've turned your work, it should look something like this. We can kind of see the stitch pattern start to take shape. We've got a bottom point right here. Follow that up, we have one of our top points there. And then if we slide this over, we have another bottom point right here. Now, as you knit, this will get more and more pronounced, and you can use this to help you memorize the stitch pattern, to know what you're supposed to do. Couple things that you can memorize right off the bat is the second stitch and the second to last stitch down here is always going to be a knit front back increase. As you're working in between your points, so the bottom points and the top points, knit 4. That's always going to be the case. Then when you get to the bottom points, remember you have 2 decreases. When you get to the top points, you have 2 increases. So use that as well as the written instructions to help you memorize the stitch pattern. Work up several more rows, however long you want this swatch to be, until you have the pattern memorized and you're ready to start binding off. That's what we'll look at next. Now, after you've knit up that repeat several more times, this is what your stitch pattern begins to look like. Isn't it absolutely gorgeous with this yarn? I love it with Colorscape yarn. It has a really cool texture and feel to it, and you'll notice that it doesn't do a lot of rolling. It makes it really great for a scarf. All right, so once your project reaches the length that you desire, the last thing we need to do is bind off. So we want to make sure we're doing that here on the right side of the work. So if by chance you're looking at this side of the work, you just want to go ahead and purl this row so that you can flip it and you're starting here on the right side. Now we do want to try to maintain our stitch pattern because we have sort of a jagged edge here on the bottom. We want to try to mimic that on the top as well. So we're going to continue to knit in pattern, but we're going to bind off as we go. So insert your needle knitwise. We're going to knit the first stitch. So this part of the repeat really is no different. Then our next stitch is a knit front back, just like we saw before. Now we need to bind it off. We're going to just treat this as one stitch here. So grab your first one and we'll pass it over both of these. I like to steady that with my finger there in the background so that I don't drop that off. Okay, then we're going to treat this as one stitch as well. So the next part of our repeat, we knit 4. Now we can't just knit 4 as we bind off, we have to do it little by little. So I'll knit this first one. And then I'm going to pass it over with these 2 stitches to bind it off. Now that was 1 out of 4, so I'm going to knit the next one bind it off. That was 2 out of 4. Knit the next one, bind it off for 3, 1 more, now this part of the repeat is where we slip one, knit one, and then we pass that slipped stitch over. So I will slip one, I will knit, I'll pass that slipped stitch over. But remember, that's not binding it off, that's just for our pattern. So now I'm going to take this and pass it over to bind it off. Then the next stitch is a knit 2 together. So I'll go ahead and knit 2 together. And if you need a refresher on this, just go ahead and refer to the written instructions. This is the repeat for row number 2. Then I'll go ahead and bind it off. And continue with the repeat. So we have a knit 4 up until this point, so I will knit the next one, bind it off, and 4. So let's pause here for a moment and look at what's going on. We still have our shape to our chevron or our zigzag, and that's why we're binding off in pattern. But let's say you find this completely exhausting and you just want to do a bind off that's very simple. Well, you can go ahead and bind off in knits. So basically you're going to knit 2, bind it off, knit 1, bind it off, and continue, sort of like we're doing in this section of the repeat. But when you do that, you're going to have a straight edge along the top, and it's not going to mirror or look like what you have down at the bottom. All right, so at this point we have our 2 knit front backs. We're going to go ahead and work those. And then I'm going to pass the first one over both of those 2. Then knit front back once again. And just remember that I'll be treating that as 1 once I get through this. Now when you're doing it like this, when you're passing 2 over 2, it can get a little bit tight. So if you need to pass them one at a time, then you can absolutely do that. I've got the 1 over, and then I'll just go back for the second. Much easier. Okay, so now we have that section where we knit 4. So I will knit the next stitch, use both of those to bind it off. Again, you can do both if you can, or you can do it one at a time, whatever's simplest for you. And if something like that happens, if it does slide over, before you let anything off, it's really a good idea just to try to get your needle back in that stitch so you don't have a dropped stitch there. And perhaps we'll just go back to using one at a time. Much easier this way. We'll knit the next one. This will be knit number 2 in our 4 sequence. This is 3. Four. We've come to our repeat at this point now. Depending on how long your project is, you'll want to just repeat this section, and we're going to continue on now with the slipped stitch, the knit, then the PSSO. So now with this, we've come to our repeat. Our repeat starts right after we finish that. We've knit 4, and then we have our slip, knit, PSSO, then our knit 2 together, what we saw here in this section. So I'm going to continue on with the end of my row here. You'll do the same for your project. We'll meet back up at the end of this row. We'll talk about finishing things off. Now when you reach the end of your row, you have 2 stitches remaining. Remember, on this second to last stitch, we want to knit front back for our normal pattern, so we're going to do that for the bind off as well. Then I've knit front back. I'm going to pass this one over both of these two. I'll knit the last stitch, and then I'll use both of these to pass it over the one. We'll do it one at a time here. And there you have it. That's the bind off. Of course, we can go ahead and trim ourselves a tail. You want to leave yourself 6 to 8 inches so you have a big enough tail to weave in for your project. And then I like to just sort of pull up on that, pull the tail through that loop, give that a pull. So now we can see that there's a little bit of curling on the bottom edge here that kind of curls up, and then also it's kind of curling on our cast off or our bind off edge there as well. What I like to do to really make my projects look as professional as possible, that is to wet block. So what I'll do is first saturate my project. You can do it with a spray bottle with some lukewarm water, or you can actually dunk it in the sink and just sort of soak it. And then you'll stretch it out on some type of blocking board. It's basically just a foam board. You can even use those athletic foam tiles, and then you'll pin it all down. Now what I'll do here is I will link to a resource where I talk about blocking in a lot more detail. You will see that there are some crocheted projects used in that video, but it works 100% for knitting as well, and it's a great way to take your projects to the next level.